This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So let's not pretend it matters, but today I wanted to do a video about why it is that I don't use real amps for recording very much at all. So we're very much used to this kind of debate around amps versus modelers, and the way that I think typically folks might side on this might be the idea that if it's something that's permanent, you know, like a record or something like that, that you'd want a real amp on there. This is the sort of thing that you hear some producers talk about, you know, getting inspiration from the real thing and all that sort of stuff. For instance, George Lever, producer for Sleep Token and stuff, actually got rid of a Kemper apparently for this reason, because he wanted to get back to using real amplifiers and kind of working in that way, and which is totally valid. On the flip side, you have people like Joe Satriani, who I think I actually agree with on this, who has talked quite, you know, candidly about using plugins for studio recordings. And the thing that gets me that he said, and this is obviously Joe Satriani, who has access to better gear, better personnel, and all of this stuff, and better studios than most of us will ever get within 10 feet of. He said, you know, you get to a studio, you stick your amp in there, and then you realise that microphones are not ears, and so you go to that effort, and you then even realise that, you know, it's actually a battle to get the sound that you've got in your ears to line up with what's actually happening in the room. And that is essentially, I think, my experience too. Now, Joe Satriani also went on to kind of elaborate on this a bit more recently, talking about, well, actually when I'm on stage, and recently he did some shows with the Tonemaster Pro, right, and then FR12, and then after that he's sort of talked about actually, you know, really missing kind of that feeling of having a big amp behind you, and that being an important part of guitar for him. And I also kind of think that that is true too. In a scenario where you are able to play with a real amplifier, I think most of us probably will say, you know, there's a bit more fun to be had there. There are other inconveniences potentially, but for me, I've been gigging for the past sort of year and a half with a real amplifier, specifically because I wanted that interaction with a real amplifier on stage. I wanted to get back to this idea of using a couple of pedals in front of an amplifier and making use of some of the gear that I have. Otherwise, I might as well just get rid of it. I recognise that I don't have, you know, loads of gigs per year, so the ones that I do, I want to kind of enjoy as much as possible, and using a real amp was part of that for a lot of them as well. I was listening to Rob Harris on Rob's Funk and Junk, and he was talking about basically the smaller shows that he might do without in-ear gigs, he prefers to use a real amp for. But if you're using in-ears, and if you're on a bigger stage where the volumes, like Jamiroquai, for example, apparently they use quite quiet stage volumes, then using a real amp in some of these scenarios is not any longer, you know, the way that he chooses to do things. He's gone down the modelling route for that. But still, you know, if it was a more intimate show, a club, a pub, that sort of thing, I think a real amp is, yeah, and for me as well, the more fun thing to do, and you get a bit more of that interaction with an amp type thing going on. The reason that I don't use amps at home is a little bit different, and it's more to do with workflow. So if you're not aware, basically most of my videos are recorded, like the instrumental part is recorded in like 1 or 2 takes at most. I kind of stick on a click track in my audio interface, choose a key, and start playing. I do sort of like a automatic kind of looping thing where I have an idea of sort of 2-3 chords that I'm going to play, and then I loop and layer a part over that, and then I go back into the DAW and kind of cut those across to make the things that you hear me playing over. That's kind of my process, and then I improvise over that. Now there's a few reasons that a real amp doesn't really suit me in this case. So first of all, using a click track in a room like this means that you get a little bit of bleed onto the microphone. Depending on how loud you have the amp, that might be quite noticeable. If you've got it louder, then it's less noticeable, but you do get, you know, that click coming through. And particularly when you're then layering tracks, you're going to get more click. Now, in the real world, you presumably use headphones for this sort of thing, but I personally don't really like the feeling of having headphones on my head at all when you have like a cable it all feels a little bit confined to me, which is kind of the opposite of what playing with a real amp should feel like, right? So there's that little bit of trade-off there. One of the things that I can do to get around this is to, instead of using a click track, use a drum track. You're going to get bleed through, but it's going to be less noticeable than the click, because the drums will eventually be on the track anyway, if that makes sense, whereas the click sounds a bit unnatural. That's point one. It's a little bit impractical for me in terms of bleed through and that sort of stuff. Two, the volume is an issue for me, and for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I have a nearly 1-year-old baby and a wife who I don't really want to subject to my playing at all times, at all volumes. And sometimes I'm recording at like 7 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes I'm recording after they've gone to bed, sort of 8 o'clock at night. And I think it's in those circumstances appropriate to be considerate, and also thinking of neighbours and that sort of thing. Now, I do have a few amps that I could use for this sort of stuff, but even like the 15 watt Matchless Lightning clone is still going to be pretty loud, and especially if you're going to get these things to do the edge of breakup thing or whatever. And in a room this size, which is what, maybe like 4 by 3 meters or something, I don't think it's that practical. Another thing I think happens is that I play less in time with a real amplifier, presumably because my playing is coming through louder than potentially what I'm hearing over here. So over here I've got my computer playing the click track, and it's very much easier to drown my click track out when I'm playing with a real amplifier. I don't have that problem so much if I'm just playing through the speakers direct with a modeler, because everything is coming out basically at the same volume from the same place, whereas an amp easily exceeds the volume that I would normally record at. So basically the recording level and volume comes up, and then, you know, I have to turn up the monitors over here to get more volume in the room, and then that click track comes up, which might bleed through onto here. So it's all a bit of a, that's a bit of a compromise too, right? So another thing I think happens when the volume goes up, and if you've ever kind of stepped outside of a gig situation, you kind of like when you're going to the toilet or something, suddenly things potentially sound way less in tune than they did in the room. And I think it's a thing that things, when they are louder, we perceive them as essentially being better than they are. And I guess this is also partly why when you go back and look at like camera phone footage, it's like, oh, I didn't remember it sounding as dodgy as that. That's definitely a thing I've noticed, and I find it harder to notice tuning issues when I'm playing with a real amp in the room, just because that volume is that much louder that I'm doing, I think, less critical kind of listening, and definitely hearing less of the guitar in context. I'm hearing more of just the guitar, maybe less of the track, and it's a bit maybe more difficult to intonate off of that. That's another thing that I've definitely noticed myself. Another thing, and this is, I think, the main reason that I don't like to record in amps too much, it is a nice thing to do now and then, but they're not part of my usual workflow, is because it's really difficult for me in my way of working and stuff to end up with an end product that sounds better than I'd get with a modeler, because basically I'm not a mic expert or anything like that, and things move around the room, right? So, you know, you might use the mic for one thing and then use it for another. In terms of placing the microphone in a place that consistently works for me, I don't have a method for that yet. And if I'm wanting to get things done in kind of like a first take scenario where I just stick the camera on, stick a click track going and get recording, is completely in the lap of the gods whether that thing ends up sounding good to me or not. And especially if you're using quite a bit of gain, I've found that what sounds really good in the room, and I guess it's the thing that Satriani is kind of talking about, you record it and you think, yeah, that take was fine, and then you go back and you listen to it, you're like, that's not exactly what it sounded like when I was playing it. It might have way too much bass, or it might sound super fizzy. Now, these are things that, of course, you could fix in post with EQ, but I tried to kind of keep things roughly as they sounded, because I feel like, you know, it is at least representing something real. But that's a thing for me where mic placement is not necessarily anything I'm good at all. And I guess there must be ways that people do actually like settle on a way that works for them. I don't know what those are. Maybe I should look that up. But maybe you mark on the speaker or on the cab grill where you'd set it. I don't know. Maybe you do a bit of experimenting with a loop pedal. And yeah, maybe that's something I should do actually. But something that could kind of change this around for me a little bit, and something that has actually been consistently really good whenever I've done this with tube amps, is using a load box. Now I've got a Fractal X Load, the LB2, and running into an IR like on my HX Stomp and into my rig that way, it has actually yielded, I think, way better results. I think that's what I used for the 2-Rock SSS demo. I think I've done it for a bunch of stuff, maybe the Mesa Boogie Lone Star demo that I did. I think that for me has been the best way. So that way I can get the kind of tubeness, but also be able to involve it in my workflow in a way that the volume in the room doesn't have to be even on. It can be basically a silent recording. So I have none of the other problems that I had before. The only thing that then it does mean is that there's more cables running out through the room, and again, that's the reason I think I do it less than not, because for me right now, the easiest workflow is just to plug straight into my audio interface and record, and then use Helix Native or something like that, or a Neural DSP plugin. That for me at the moment is pretty much the top workflow, and I think maybe that's the way things might end up going a little bit. Aside from that, there are other options, like you could use an isolated cab, but I'm not going to buy an extra piece of gear to do that. One of the things that I noticed using my ported cabinet that I've got is that would actually woof out and crap out the mic that I've got. So that's another thing that sometimes using a real amp can quite easily clip your mic if you're using a condenser mic, and then you've kind of ruined a take potentially. So there's a bunch of reasons for me why I prefer actually using a digital solution. As much as I might love the way these amps sound in the room, sometimes it's just easier to leave them turned off. Let me know if you're in the same boat, or if you've found it works better in other ways. I'd love to know your thoughts. I think it's difficult to show up to certain kind of scenarios. You know, say you were recording for someone's album, Ollie, and you showed up with a modeler, and you know they're paying for studio time. I think in some ways there's an expectation that in some scenarios you will show up with an amplifier, but in others, yeah, I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. For me, an amp live, a modeler in the studio, that seems to work quite nicely for me. I say studio, the bedroom. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I was using the JCB Assman preset in the intro. I'm really loving that one actually. And I'll chuck that backing track up onto Patreon if you want it. That was based on some kind of fiddling that I did with the Walrus Audio Meraki yesterday, and I was really liking the sounds that I could get from kind of just switching the time, and it kind of gave these cool like synth-like tones. So yeah, that's basically why I don't use amps every day. Even though I've got some, I've had some really nice ones, they actually don't integrate into my workflow quite as well as the digital stuff.